Picture this. Two of the world's most powerful empires, locked in a battle, not over land, not over armies, but over a substance that would go on to shape the course of history. The First Opium War, fought between the British Empire and China in the early 19th century, was not just another military conflict. It was a clash of ideologies, a collision of cultures, and the spark that ignited a period of profound upheaval for China, one that would last for over a century. But how did it come to this? How did the trade of a drug become the catalyst for such a monumental event in world history? At the heart of this conflict was a simple question. Who controls the flow of opium? On one side, Britain, eager to maintain its trading rights and profits, and on the other, China, determined to protect its sovereignty and its people from the devastating effects of this addictive substance. What began as a dispute over trade soon escalated into a violent confrontation, with devastating consequences for both empires. But it was not just a war of armies. It was a war of values, of morality, of power. Britain, armed with its military might, sought to defend its right to trade opium freely, while China, under the leadership of its Qing Dynasty, fought to preserve its laws, its traditions, and its very identity. Today, we are going to unravel the story of how this conflict began, the people who played key roles, and the far-reaching consequences that shaped the future of China, Britain, and the world. What led to this war? Who were the men and women whose decisions would set the stage for years of turmoil? And most importantly, what lessons can we learn from a conflict that still resonates today? Let us dive in and explore how the opium trade sparked a war that would change the world forever. To truly grasp the depth of the First Opium War, we need to step back into history, far before the guns began to roar and the ships lined up along China's shores. Let us travel to the mid-16th century, a time when the world was still in its infancy when it came to global trade, and when empires were beginning to realize the vast potential of the oceans that connected them all. This was a time when Portugal, a small but ambitious European power, first planted its flag on the shores of Macau in 1557, a tiny outpost leased from the Qing Dynasty. It was not just a trade deal. It marked the beginning of something far greater, the beginning of direct maritime trade between Europe and China. Now, imagine this moment. A small group of Portuguese traders, brimming with excitement, stepping onto the soil of a land that was known for its richest silks, porcelain, tea, the kind of treasures that sparked imaginations and inspired explorers across the globe. This tiny port of Macau would soon become a bustling gateway for Europeans, an entry point for the world's most coveted goods. And it did not take long for the other European powers, like the Spanish, the Dutch, and most importantly, the British, to realize that China was a treasure trove waiting to be unlocked. The 17th century came, and with it, European ships began to frequent the Chinese coast. Yet, despite the obvious allure of China's wealth, trade was not exactly open to everyone. China, with its immense power and sovereignty, was very selective about who it allowed to trade and where. The Chinese tributary system, deeply rooted in the country's cultural and political fabric, determined who could enter their markets. This system, in essence, was about maintaining control. Only select foreign powers were permitted to engage in trade, and only through specific, designated ports. It was not a free-for-all. The Chinese were content to keep most outsiders at arm's length, controlling the terms of their interactions. The foreigners, eager for a piece of China's vast fortune, had to play by the rules of the Qing Dynasty, a dynasty that was powerful and proud, yet deeply conservative in its dealings with the outside world. But that did not stop the Europeans. The British, in particular, were undeterred by these limitations. They had a growing thirst for China's treasures, and as the power of the British Empire continued to expand, so did its ambitions. Enter the British East India Company, the heartbeat of British trade in Asia. Armed with a royal charter that gave them a monopoly on British trade in the East India Company quickly established itself as a dominant player in the region. Initially focused on India, where they had already secured a strong foothold, the British now set their sights on China, determined to crack open the doors of this mysterious and wealthy land. In the early days of the 17th century, trade between China and Britain was far from smooth. The Chinese, wary of foreign influence and their own strict regulations, only allowed British merchants to trade at a few designated ports, such as Guangzhou or Canton, as the Europeans called it. This was a pivotal location sitting on the Pearl River. It became the center of foreign trade, the one spot where Europe and China could meet, but it was not an easy relationship. For the British, the restrictions were frustrating. While the Chinese controlled access to their markets, they also held the upper hand in the trade balance. The British, who were desperate for Chinese goods, had to pay in silver, a precious commodity that was being drained from European coffers. In fact, at first, the trade was heavily imbalanced in China's favor. The Europeans, particularly the British, had to find a way to balance this, to fill the gap between what they wanted and what they were willing to give in return, and that is where the story takes an unexpected turn. The British, resourceful as ever, found a solution to their trade woes. They were not content with just silk and porcelain. They knew they needed something that could tip the balance in their favor, something that would make their trade with China more than just a one-way exchange of silver. The answer, opium. It was a risky, controversial move, but it would change everything. In the 18th century, opium, once a relatively minor commodity, became Britain's secret weapon. British merchants, especially those operating in India, began cultivating large quantities of opium, a drug that had long been used in Asia for medicinal purposes but was now finding its way into the hands of more and more Chinese citizens. The British East India Company, which controlled vast swaths of India, found that selling opium to the Chinese was not only profitable, but also a way to balance their trade deficit. Opium, after all, was a luxury product that could be sold for a high price, and the Chinese, with their demand for silver, would readily pay for it. This trade in opium grew quickly, and it was not long before it became the driving force behind the Anglo-Chinese relationship. Britain, now deeply invested in the opium trade, was determined to continue its dealings, while China, seeing the devastating impact the drug was having on its people and its economy, took a stand. The opium trade, which had started off as a profitable but illicit business, would soon become the spark that ignited one of the most consequential wars in history. But how did things get so far? Why did Britain, a nation that prided itself on its own sense of morality, continue to push opium on China even when it knew the harm it was causing? And why did China, despite its immense power, find itself unable to stop this foreign influence? These questions are at the heart of the First Opium War, and they are questions we will answer as we continue our journey into the heart of this conflict, to understand how two nations, once engaged in peaceful trade, would be dragged into war over a substance that had the power to destroy both of them. So stay with me as we explore how the trade of opium, something so small yet so powerful, would lead to a clash of empires, one that would forever alter the course of history. As European demand for China's treasures, silk, porcelain, tea grew to insatiable levels, Britain found itself facing a problem, a massive trade imbalance. China, with its wealth of resources, demanded silver in exchange for its goods, and the British, while flush with precious metals from their colonies in the Americas, had one significant issue: they were running low on silver. While the British could offer goods of their own, they could not match the demand for Chinese products. The balance was tipping in China's favor, and Britain needed a way to right the scales. That is when an unlikely solution arose, a solution that would, in time, alter the very course of history. The British Empire, known for its resourcefulness and ambition, soon found that there was one commodity they could provide to the Chinese in exchange for their wealth: opium. Though it had been known in China for centuries, opium had never been a major part of its social fabric. In fact, opium consumption was a relatively minor issue for the Chinese people until the British turned it into a booming trade. It was a bold, if not morally questionable, move. Britain would use opium to pay for the goods it so desperately desired from China. The British East India Company, operating in India, saw a unique opportunity. There, they began cultivating large amounts of opium in the fertile lands of Bengal, producing it in such quantities that it would soon flood the market, both in India and, more importantly, in China. By the 1820s, the opium trade had exploded. What had started as a small-scale operation soon became a vital part of Britain's economic interests. British merchants, with their ships laden with opium, sailed from India to the Chinese coast, where the drug was eagerly purchased. While Britain's economy reaped the rewards, China began to feel the deep, toxic effects of this illicit trade. At first, the scale of opium consumption in China was relatively small, but over time, as the drug flowed in greater quantities, the consequences became impossible to ignore. The opium trade was not just a simple exchange of goods. It was an economic lifeline for Britain, a necessary component of its global power and influence. British merchants profited immensely, and as the demand for opium grew, so did the number of ships sailing to China's ports. By the 1820s, opium had become one of Britain's most profitable exports to China, and the British government, with its vested interests in maintaining this trade, turned a blind eye to the devastating social consequences that were beginning to unfold in China. The British Empire, in its pursuit of wealth and influence, saw the opium trade as a necessary evil, a way to secure the resources they needed while keeping the wheels of their empire turning smoothly. But the consequences for China were dire. As more and more Chinese citizens became addicted to opium, the social fabric of the empire began to unravel. Opium addiction spread across all layers of Chinese society, from the common people to the elite. The effects were devastating, not just on the individuals addicted to the drug, but on families, communities, and the economy at large. The government of the Qing Dynasty, though aware of the growing problem, found itself unable to stop the flood of opium pouring into the country. The trade was deeply entrenched, with foreign merchants operating under the protection of British naval power, making it difficult for Chinese authorities to enforce their laws. By the time the 1830s arrived, China's internal strife over opium had reached a boiling point. The social costs were staggering, with millions of Chinese citizens falling victim to addiction. The Chinese government, under the leadership of Commissioner Lin Zexu, began to take drastic measures. Lin, who had been appointed by the emperor to stem the tide of opium, was an outspoken critic of the trade. He saw the destruction it was causing to Chinese society, and he vowed to take action. His solution: the complete destruction of the opium stockpiles in Canton, where foreign merchants had stored their contraband. In 1839, Lin seized over 20,000 chests of opium, valued at millions of pounds, and ordered it to be destroyed. This bold move, however, was seen as an act of war by the British. To them, the opium trade was not just a commodity, it was a vital part of their empire's economic system. They could not afford to let China disrupt this trade. The British government, fueled by its economic interests, prepared to defend its merchants and its right to trade freely. It was not just a conflict over a substance. It was a clash of ideologies. The British were defending what they saw as their right to conduct business without interference, while the Chinese were fighting to protect their people from the ravages of addiction and preserve their sovereignty. The opium trade, which had once seemed like a simple solution to a trade imbalance, had now escalated into a full-blown crisis. The Opium War was imminent, and the stakes were higher than ever. The British, armed with their naval superiority and their unwavering determination to protect their economic interests, were prepared to fight. Meanwhile, the Qing Dynasty, struggling with internal dissent and external pressures, had to choose between submission or resistance. As tensions mounted, the world was on the brink of a conflict that would reshape the future of China and Britain. This was not just a battle for trade. It was a battle for control over a nation's destiny, a battle over power, influence, and morality. The opium trade, once seen as a simple exchange, had become the catalyst for one of the most defining wars of the 19th century. The fate of two great empires hung in the balance, and the consequences of their actions would reverberate for years to come. Stay with me as we continue to explore how this dangerous trade would lead to war, and how the battle for opium would shape the future of both Britain and China. By the 1830s, China found itself in a state of crisis, its society teetering on the brink of collapse under the weight of an insidious force, opium. The drug had spread like wildfire throughout the empire, and its grip on the people was tightening. The consequences were far-reaching and devastating, not only on the individuals who had fallen prey to addiction, but also on the very fabric of Chinese society. The people, once vibrant and industrious, were now weakened by the effects of the drug, leaving communities fractured and helpless. But the damage did not stop at the social level. The economic toll was equally severe. As Chinese citizens became more reliant on opium, the demand for it skyrocketed, and silver, precious hard-earned silver, began to flow out of China in exchange for the drug. The opium trade, once a trickle, had now become a torrent, draining the empire's wealth and leaving the government scrambling to retain control. Emperor Daoguang, who had been watching the situation with growing concern, knew that China was in danger of losing its sovereignty, its wealth, and its very future if something was not done. His court had been discussing the opium crisis for years, but it was only when the situation reached a boiling point that decisive action was taken. The emperor, desperate to stop the hemorrhaging of silver and the societal decay caused by opium addiction, appointed a man who would go down in history for his boldness and resolve, Commissioner Lin Zexu. Lin was no ordinary official. He was a man of conviction, unafraid to challenge the foreign powers that had infiltrated China's markets. Appointed to oversee the enforcement of the emperor's edict, Lin wasted no time in setting his plan into motion. His mission was clear: put an end to the opium trade by any means necessary. Lin's approach was direct and uncompromising. He began by organizing the confiscation of opium from foreign merchants, focusing particularly on the British traders in the southern port of Canton. His most famous action, however, came in 1839 when he seized over 20,000 crates of British opium, worth millions of pounds, and ordered it to be publicly destroyed. The sight of thousands of chests of opium being destroyed in front of foreign merchants and the watching crowds sent a clear message: China would no longer tolerate the opium trade. Lin's actions, however, were seen as an act of war by the British. To them, this was not just about the destruction of a commodity, it was about their economic lifeline. The opium trade had become essential to Britain's balance of trade, and the revenues generated from it were crucial to maintaining the British Empire's global influence. For the British, the destruction of the opium was a direct affront to their interests and an attack on their merchant activities in China. Lin's bold move was not just an attack on the drug, it was an attack on British economic stability, and the British were not about to let it slide. The British government was quick to react. At the time, the British Empire was at the height of its imperial power, with the Royal Navy unmatched in its strength. The idea that a foreign power, especially one as distant as China, would interfere with British trade was intolerable. The British saw their merchants' right to conduct business as non-negotiable, and they believed that any challenge to that right must be met with force. The East India Company, which had been the primary force behind the opium trade, lobbied the British government hard, urging them to take action against China. The British public, though somewhat divided, was largely sympathetic to the traders and merchants who had invested so heavily in the opium business. As tensions between Britain and China mounted, the British government made its intentions clear. They would not let China dictate the terms of their trade. With their economic interests on the line, the British began to prepare for military intervention. They would not allow China to stand in the way of their lucrative opium trade. The British Royal Navy, with its formidable fleet of warships, was dispatched to the Chinese coast to secure British trading rights and force the Chinese to reopen the opium trade. The destruction of the opium stockpiles in Canton had ignited a firestorm. Lin Zexu had thrown down the gauntlet, challenging Britain's power, and in doing so he had set the stage for a conflict that would alter the course of history. What had begun as a struggle over trade had quickly morphed into a full-scale military confrontation. The British, with their superior naval power, were determined to defend their economic interests. The Chinese, on the other hand, were resolute in their determination to rid their nation of the scourge of opium, even if it meant facing the might of the British Empire. This clash, which would come to be known as the First Opium War, was more than just a battle for opium. It was a confrontation between two very different worlds, one that saw trade as a right and commerce as king, and another that viewed sovereignty and the protection of its people as sacred. The war was not just about the drug. It was about the very future of China and its place in the world. Would China continue to stand firm against foreign influence, or would it be forced to bend to the will of the West? As the British prepared for war, the world watched with bated breath. The stakes were higher than ever before. The First Opium War was not just a conflict over a substance. It was a battle for power, control, and the very soul of a nation. And as both sides braced for the coming storm, no one could predict just how far-reaching the consequences of this war would be, not just for China and Britain, but for the world itself. The opium trade, which had seemed like a small issue just a few decades earlier, had become the spark that ignited a global conflict. The actions of one man, Lin Zexu, would set in motion events that would forever change the course of history. Stay with me as we explore the dramatic escalation of the conflict and see how this war would reshape the world in ways no one could have predicted. In response to Lin Zexu's decisive actions in 1839, the British Empire, unwavering in its defensive economic interests, began to prepare for a military showdown. The destruction of the opium stockpiles in Canton was seen not just as a challenge to British trade, but as an affront to British pride. The British government, under Queen Victoria, could not allow China to dictate the terms of trade, especially when so much wealth was at stake. The opium trade, though illegal in Britain, was defended by the British government as a matter of property rights and free trade. The British argued that the destruction of opium was, in effect, a destruction of property, and they viewed it as a gross violation of their merchants' rights to trade freely in foreign markets. Despite the moral hypocrisy of the situation, the British stance was clear. The destruction of their opium stock was property damage, and they would not stand idly by while their economic interests were threatened. The British, with their unrivaled naval power, were quick to act. The Royal Navy, the most formidable military force on the planet at the time, was dispatched to China, its ships armed and ready for battle. The British government, under mounting pressure from traders and merchants whose livelihoods depended on the opium trade, resolved to use force to protect their interests. The conflict, which had started as a trade dispute, was now on the verge of becoming a full-scale war. The opium that had once flowed so freely into China was now the flashpoint for an international crisis. By the summer of 1840, the British had established a strong presence off the Chinese coast. Under the command of Captain Charles Elliot, British forces began to blockade key Chinese ports, effectively choking off trade and bringing the country to its knees. The Chinese, despite their size and historical power, were no match for the naval might of Britain. The Qing Dynasty's forces, already weakened by internal strife and corruption, struggled to mount an effective resistance. The British, by contrast, were well-equipped, well-funded, and deeply committed to ensuring that their economic interests were preserved at all costs. The first major naval confrontation came quickly as the British sought to assert their dominance. The Chinese fleet, though brave, was outclassed by the British warships, which sailed into Chinese waters with little resistance. Captain Elliot, commanding the British forces, was determined to make a decisive impact. The British forces quickly began to engage with Chinese warships and coastal defenses, capturing strategic positions and forcing Chinese authorities to retreat. The speed and efficiency of the British Navy in these initial engagements were nothing short of astonishing. The British ships, with their advanced weaponry and tactics, obliterated the Chinese forces with little effort. As the conflict escalated, British forces began to strike deeper into Chinese territory. The British Navy, using their superior firepower and technological advantage, began to bombard coastal cities, forcing China to submit to British demands. The attacks were swift, brutal, and relentless. Chinese resistance, though fierce at times, was no match for the overwhelming might of the British war machine. British forces captured key coastal cities and ports, further tightening the noose around China's neck. By the end of 1840, the British had gained a decisive upper hand in the conflict. Their blockade of Chinese ports had crippled the country's economy, and their naval victories had shattered China's defenses. The Qing Dynasty, facing humiliation and destruction, had no choice but to seek a resolution. In the face of British aggression, China's leadership began to question whether they could continue to stand firm against such a powerful adversary. However, the British were not content to simply blockade and attack. They made it clear that they wanted more than just an end to the conflict. They wanted an official treaty, one that would guarantee Britain's continued dominance in Chinese markets and secure the opium trade for the foreseeable future. The British demanded that China open its doors to more foreign trade, including the opium trade, and that they make significant concessions to the British Empire. In 1842, after years of escalating violence and mounting pressure, China was forced to sign the Treaty of Nanjing, a peace agreement that would forever change the course of Chinese history. The Treaty of Nanjing, though officially ending the First Opium War, was far from a fair agreement. China, in its weakened state, was forced to make concessions that would have far-reaching consequences. The treaty ceded the island of Hong Kong to Britain, granted Britain access to 5 major ports for trade, and imposed heavy reparations on China for the loss of British opium. The treaty also opened up China to foreign influence, fundamentally altering the country's relationship with the rest of the world. For China, the Treaty of Nanjing marked the beginning of what would become known as the Century of Humiliation. The treaty was seen as a symbol of China's weakened state, and it set the stage for further foreign intervention and exploitation in the decades to come. For Britain, the treaty was a victory, securing not only the opium trade but also expanding their influence over one of the world's oldest and most powerful civilizations. The First Opium War, though officially over, had far-reaching consequences, not only for China, but for the entire global balance of power. As the British Navy sailed away from the Chinese coast, victorious and emboldened, China was left to deal with the aftermath of a war that had irreversibly changed its future. The opium trade, which had begun as a way to balance trade, had now become the catalyst for a series of events that would shape the destiny of 2 great empires. The British, having secured their dominance over the Chinese market, could now focus on expanding their imperial reach, while China, humiliated and broken, would begin a long and painful journey of reform and recovery. The First Opium War, though fought over opium, was far more than just a conflict over a commodity. It was a clash of ideologies, a battle for power and influence, and the beginning of a new era in world history. The effects of this war would reverberate for generations, leaving a lasting legacy on both China and the Western powers. And as we continue to explore the consequences of this war, we will see how it set the stage for China's transformation and its eventual rise as a global power in the 20th century. By 1842, the Qing Dynasty, having endured numerous humiliating defeats, was on the brink of collapse. The First Opium War had shown just how fragile China's power had become in the face of foreign aggression. The Qing forces, though brave and determined, were no match for the overwhelming might of the British Empire, which had proven its naval superiority time and time again. The war, which had started as a struggle to preserve Chinese sovereignty and eliminate the opium scourge, had turned into a fight for survival. As the British forces marched forward, capturing strategic ports and cities along the Chinese coast, the Qing government found itself with little leverage and even less hope of winning. The emperor, faced with mounting pressure from all sides, was forced to negotiate a peace treaty that would forever alter China's place in the world. In 1842, after years of brutal conflict, the Qing dynasty was forced to sign the Treaty of Nanjing, effectively ending the First Opium War. But this was no ordinary peace agreement. It was a treaty that would mark China's first unequal treaty, a term that would become synonymous with the forced concessions and humiliations that China would endure at the hands of foreign powers over the next century. The Treaty of Nanjing was a clear and painful symbol of China's defeat. The British had emerged victorious, and they were eager to cement their dominance over China, to ensure that no future resistance would ever be allowed to threaten their interests again. The treaty demanded that China cede the island of Hong Kong to Britain, forever altering the geopolitical landscape of the region. Hong Kong, once a small strategic outpost, would become a powerful symbol of British control in Asia. The British knew the value of Hong Kong's location, its harbor, and its potential as a trade hub, and they wasted no time in turning it into a center of commerce and influence. The British flag would fly over Hong Kong for over a century, a constant reminder to China of the humiliation it had suffered in the war. But the treaty's impact on China did not end with the loss of Hong Kong. The British demanded that China open 5 major ports, Canton, Shanghai, Ningbo, Fuzhou, and Xiamen, to foreign trade. These ports would become centers of British influence, where British merchants could conduct business without interference from the Qing government. The opening of these ports would forever change the structure of Chinese trade, allowing foreign powers to flood the country with goods, capital, and influence. The Qing government, once able to regulate foreign trade and limit its influence, was now powerless to stop the influx of foreign merchants and goods. Perhaps the most humiliating aspect of the treaty, though, was the granting of extraterritorial rights to British citizens in China. This provision meant that British nationals in China were not subject to Chinese law. Instead, they were to be governed by British law, under the protection of British consuls. The Chinese government, now forced to accept this foreign legal system within its borders, had no say in the legal affairs of foreign nationals. This not only undermined China's sovereignty, but also marked a profound shift in the balance of power between the Qing Dynasty and the Western powers. No longer could China control the actions of foreigners within its own territory. Now it was subject to the whims of foreign governments and their citizens. For China, the Treaty of Nanjing was nothing short of a catastrophe. It marked the beginning of what would come to be known as the Century of Humiliation, a period in which China would be forced to endure a series of defeats and foreign interventions that would shatter its confidence and weaken its global standing. This was a time when foreign powers Britain, France, Germany, Japan, and others exploited China's internal weaknesses and forced it to concede territory, trade rights, and sovereignty. The Treaty of Nanjing, with its brutal terms and its devastating impact on China's sovereignty, set the stage for a long period of foreign dominance and humiliation that would last until the mid-20th century. For the British, however, the Treaty of Nanjing was a triumph. They had achieved their goals, securing the opium trade, opening new markets for British goods, and ensuring British control over key territories in China. The treaty represented not just a military victory, but a clear demonstration of British power and influence in Asia. It solidified Britain's position as the dominant foreign power in China, and paved the way for further territorial and economic concessions in the years to come. The aftermath of the Treaty of Nanjing left China reeling. The empire, once a dominant force in Asia, had been forced to bow to the will of the British Empire, and its humiliation would have far-reaching consequences for the country. The Qing government, weakened and demoralized, would struggle to regain its authority in the face of growing foreign influence and internal strife. The Treaty of Nanjing would be remembered as the beginning of a long and painful era in China's history, one that would be defined by foreign exploitation, internal unrest, and a profound sense of national shame. As the years passed, the impact of the treaty would be felt throughout Chinese society. The loss of Hong Kong, the opening of China's ports to foreign trade, and the erosion of Chinese sovereignty would all contribute to the decline of the Qing Dynasty and the rise of revolutionary movements. The memory of the Treaty of Nanjing and the sense of humiliation it brought to China would inspire generations of Chinese leaders and intellectuals to seek a way to restore their country's dignity and strength. The Treaty of Nanjing was more than just a diplomatic agreement. It was a turning point in Chinese history, one that would shape the course of the nation for over a century. For China, the journey to recovery and renewal would be long and arduous, but the legacy of the Treaty of Nanjing would remain with the Chinese people for generations to come. It was a painful reminder of the vulnerability of an empire that had once been invincible, and a stark lesson in the dangers of foreign intervention and exploitation. The Treaty of Nanjing, in its aftermath, would continue to shape China's relationships with the outside world, serving as a constant reminder of the fragility of its sovereignty and the price of foreign dominance. The First Opium War was far from being a simple trade dispute. It was a dramatic reflection of the wider, more complex issues of the 19th century: imperialism, economic imbalance, and deep cultural clashes. For Britain, the opium trade was not merely a business venture. It represented the very heart of its imperial ambitions. Britain saw itself as a champion of free trade, a nation that spread the ideals of liberalism and economic freedom across the globe. The British Empire, at the height of its power, believed it had the right to open markets, expand its influence, and secure its economic interests, no matter the cost. The opium trade, with its huge profits, was seen not just as a commodity, but as a symbol of British progress and dominance in the global economy. However, for China, the trade was something very different. It was not a symbol of progress, but a devastating force that threatened to tear apart the very fabric of society. Opium, once a relatively minor issue, had become an economic and social disaster. As more and more opium flooded into the country, Chinese society began to unravel. Addiction spread rapidly, crippling communities and leading to a loss of productivity, not to mention the outflow of silver that was needed to purchase the drug. This was not just an economic crisis. It was a crisis of morality, culture, and national pride. The Qing Dynasty, with its centuries-old traditions, saw this foreign drug as a tool of cultural destruction, and they viewed Britain's insistence on the trade as an attack on China's sovereignty and self-respect. The opium trade, therefore, was not just about the exchange of goods. It was about two fundamentally different worldviews colliding. Britain, with its industrial might, saw the trade as an extension of its right to open up markets and spread its economic system. For China, however, the trade represented the collapse of social order and the erosion of national identity. To the British, it was a transaction, a trade in which both parties gained. China received British silver, and Britain gained access to a lucrative market. But to China, it was an existential threat, an invasion of its values, its economy, and its future. This clash of ideologies only deepened the sense of resentment and distrust on both sides. While Britain believed it was simply participating in free trade, China viewed the opium trade as the imposition of foreign values that sought to weaken its power. In this context, the First Opium War became more than just a dispute over trade. It became a battle for survival. It was a battle for the preservation of China's cultural and economic integrity against the encroaching forces of Western imperialism. The real loser in this conflict, though, was clear: China. The Treaty of Nanjing, signed in 1842, did not just end the First Opium War. It effectively opened the door for further exploitation by foreign powers. The British, as part of the treaty, gained not only Hong Kong, but also access to key Chinese ports, where they would conduct business without interference from the Qing government. With these new privileges, Britain solidified its foothold in Chinese trade and politics. But the consequences for China were devastating. The treaty stripped the Chinese government of its authority over foreign trade, leaving it powerless to regulate the flow of opium and other goods into the country. Foreigners, British, French, and others, could now operate in China without having to follow Chinese law, further undermining the sovereignty of the Qing Dynasty. The Treaty of Nanjing was a bitter pill for the Chinese to swallow, and it left a deep scar on the national psyche. Not only did it result in the loss of Hong Kong, but it also forced China to pay huge indemnities to Britain and open up more cities to foreign trade. This was just the beginning of a period of sustained foreign dominance that would last for over a century. The treaty marked the beginning of what would later be known as the Century of Humiliation, a time when China's sovereignty was repeatedly undermined by Western powers, and the once proud empire was forced to cede territory, resources, and power. The Treaty of Nanjing was not just a peace agreement. It was a symbol of the vast inequality that existed between China and the Western powers, and it set the stage for further territorial concessions and foreign intervention in the years that followed. The implications of the treaty would reverberate for generations. The loss of Hong Kong to the British would continue to haunt China, as the island became a symbol of British power in Asia, a permanent reminder of China's vulnerability. More importantly, the opening of Chinese ports to foreign trade under the treaty would shift the balance of power in the region, as Western countries took advantage of China's weakened position to establish their own economic and political strongholds. The Qing Dynasty, already struggling with internal unrest and corruption, was now forced to contend with the pressures of foreign intervention, and its ability to govern effectively was severely compromised. For China, the Treaty of Nanjing marked the beginning of a long and painful journey. The shock and humiliation of the treaty would give rise to a wave of reform movements in the decades to come, as intellectuals, military leaders, and politicians sought to reclaim China's lost power. But even as China began to modernize and attempt to strengthen itself, the legacy of the First Opium War and the Treaty of Nanjing remained a painful reminder of its past subjugation. For the Chinese people, the war was not just a military defeat. It was a cultural and psychological wound that would take decades to heal. In the end, the First Opium War was more than just a battle over trade. It was the beginning of China's long struggle to reassert its sovereignty in the face of imperialism. It marked the first time China had been forced to accept a foreign power's demands under duress, and the consequences of that moment would shape Chinese history for generations. While Britain emerged victorious, the true cost of the war was paid by China, whose struggle to regain its dignity and strength would continue well into the 20th century. The war was not just a conflict over opium. It was a symbol of the broader forces of imperialism that would define the global order for much of the next century. And as China would later demonstrate, the legacy of that humiliation would fuel its rise as a global power, determined never again to be subjugated by foreign forces. The consequences of the opium trade, especially in the wake of the First Opium War, would haunt China for decades, leaving deep scars on the nation's social fabric and economy. While the Treaty of Nanjing marked a clear victory for Britain, it also laid the groundwork for long-term suffering in China. In the years that followed the treaty, the trade of opium continued to flourish, with British merchants increasing their influence over Chinese ports. This was no longer just a matter of importing a profitable commodity. It was a question of national survival for China. The destructive consequences of the opium trade were felt not only on the individual level, but across the whole of Chinese society. One of the most tragic effects of the opium trade was the widespread addiction it caused. As the drug flooded China in increasing quantities, it took root in communities, particularly in urban centers and port towns. By the mid-19th century, millions of Chinese people were addicted to opium, and the toll it took on the labor force was devastating. Men, once productive workers and heads of households, found themselves consumed by their dependency on opium. The addiction gradually destroyed their ability to work, leading to a sharp decline in productivity. Entire families were left struggling to survive as their primary breadwinners were incapacitated by the drug. The loss of human capital was a crippling blow to the Chinese economy. Skilled workers and laborers who were essential to the agricultural and industrial sectors were now unable to contribute to society in any meaningful way. With so many men addicted to opium, women were often left to shoulder the burden of running households and providing for their families. This disruption of the labor force created an economic crisis that rippled throughout the country, making it harder for the Qing Dynasty to manage the growing internal unrest. But the devastation of the opium trade was not just economic. It was also deeply social. Families were torn apart by addiction, with parents, children, and siblings all suffering in different ways. Sons grew up to find their fathers too incapacitated to guide them, and wives often found themselves alone, struggling to care for their children in an increasingly difficult world. The breakdown of family structures, combined with the increasing addiction rates, weakened the societal bonds that had once held China together. Communities that had thrived before the war now found themselves fragmented, with a growing number of people turning to opium as a means of coping with their poverty and despair. In many ways, the opium epidemic represented a silent plague that spread through the heart of China, not only physically damaging individuals, but emotionally and spiritually weakening the nation. Entire regions became synonymous with opium addiction, their people trapped in a cycle that seemed impossible to break. This widespread social degradation created a breeding ground for further unrest and rebellion. The societal wounds inflicted by opium would take generations to heal, and many of the nation's most precious resources, its people, were lost to the poison of the trade. On the other side of the world, in Britain, the moral implications of the opium trade began to stir public debate. While the British government had consistently defended the trade as a legitimate business practice, arguing that it was essential for balancing the trade deficit and maintaining the British Empire's economic power, there was growing unease among ordinary citizens about the ethics of profiting from such a destructive trade. As the realities of addiction in China became more widely known, there was increasing pressure on the British government to reconsider its stance on the opium trade. This moral dilemma divided British society. On one hand, there were those who saw the trade as a necessary evil, a means to secure wealth and power for the British Empire. On the other hand, there were reformists who viewed the trade as a stain on Britain's reputation, a dark chapter in the nation's history that could no longer be justified by economic gain. The growing public awareness of the devastating effects of opium addiction in China led to calls for reform, with prominent figures in British society speaking out against the government's role in perpetuating the trade. One of the most significant turning points in this moral debate came in the late 19th century, when social reformers and intellectuals began to question the ethics of imperialism itself. The rise of the abolitionist movement, which had successfully ended the transatlantic slave trade, encouraged many Britons to reevaluate their country's actions abroad. If Britain could condemn the exploitation of enslaved Africans, could it justify the exploitation of an entire nation through the opium trade? The moral questions surrounding the opium trade became increasingly difficult to ignore, leading to a growing sense of guilt within the British public. In time, this moral unease would lead to a reassessment of Britain's role in global trade. As pressure mounted, the British government began to take steps toward curbing the opium trade, particularly in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Though the full abolition of the opium trade would not come until the 20th century, the public outcry against it marked the beginning of a broader shift in Britain's imperial policies. The realization that the empire's wealth was built on the suffering of others began to resonate with a growing number of British citizens, signaling the start of a new era of global consciousness. This shift in British attitudes was not only a moral victory, but also an important moment in the broader history of colonialism. As Britain slowly withdrew from the opium trade, China, too, began its long journey toward recovery. However, the damage inflicted during the Opium War and the subsequent addiction crisis would take much longer to heal. The social, economic, and psychological wounds that the opium trade inflicted on Chinese society would remain for decades, and its legacy would echo through China's turbulent history. While the British Empire eventually reconsidered its role in the opium trade, the damage had already been done, and China had to pay the price. The opium trade, despite its eventual decline, had irreversibly changed both Britain and China, with each country carrying the scars of that period for years to come. For China, the damage was not just a matter of economic loss. It was a loss of dignity and autonomy that would shape the nation's outlook for generations. For Britain, it was a moral reckoning that would spark a re-examination of imperialism and colonialism, pushing the empire to confront the ethical cost of its global dominance. The First Opium War, its aftermath, and the devastating social consequences of the opium trade would be remembered as one of the most complex and painful chapters in the shared history of these two nations. The effects of the Opium War would stretch far beyond the immediate aftermath, casting long shadows over both China and Britain. For China, the signing of the Treaty of Nanjing in 1842 was a devastating moment, not just for its immediate consequences, but for the door it opened to a century of humiliation. The treaty was the first of many unequal agreements with Western powers and Japan, each one chipping away at China's sovereignty and deepening its sense of vulnerability. For the Chinese people, the Treaty of Nanjing was a bitter pill, one that would fester and scar the national consciousness for generations. It marked the beginning of a prolonged period where foreign influence and intervention in China's internal affairs were no longer a distant possibility but a harsh reality. The signing of the treaty ushered in a new era, one that saw China forced to cede territories like Hong Kong to the British, open up ports to foreign trade, and grant extraterritorial rights to foreign nationals, all while losing the ability to regulate its own trade or protect its economy from foreign exploitation. The anger and frustration felt by the Chinese were palpable, and this would give rise to a swell of nationalist sentiment that sought to reclaim China's dignity. The humiliation of the Treaty of Nanjing gave rise to anti-foreign sentiments, and as the decades went on, the calls for reform and modernization would grow louder, driven by a fierce desire to rid China of foreign dominance and restore its ancient glory. The psychological toll of these foreign incursions would fuel movements and rebellions throughout the 19th century, such as the Taiping Rebellion, which sought to overthrow the Qing Dynasty in an attempt to end the foreign influence that many saw as an existential threat to China's future. This sense of national humiliation, coupled with the deep frustration over the Qing Dynasty's inability to protect its people from foreign powers, created a volatile environment. In many ways, the events surrounding the Opium War and the treaties that followed would serve as the catalyst for a century-long struggle that ultimately transformed China into a modern world power, though not without enduring the scars of this painful history. On the British side, the immediate consequences of the Opium War were less about the emotional and psychological scars, but they were nonetheless significant. Britain, as the victor, had expanded its empire and secured key trade advantages, especially through the acquisition of Hong Kong and the opening of new ports in China. The war had seemingly proved the superiority of Britain's military might, and it had solidified British interests in Asia for the coming decades. Economically, Britain benefited immensely from the increased trade in opium and other goods, further fueling its dominance in global markets. For a time, it seemed as though the British Empire had won an unequivocal victory, with China forced to submit to British demands. However, while the war represented a tangible victory for Britain, it also sparked a growing moral quandary that would challenge the very foundations of British imperialism. Although the British government defended its actions, arguing that the opium trade was a matter of property rights and free trade, the increasingly harsh realities of the trade began to weigh heavily on public opinion. As the effects of opium addiction in China became more widely known, questions began to emerge regarding the ethics of profiting from a trade that was causing immense suffering to millions of people. Many British citizens began to ask whether the cost of empire, especially one built on such destructive practices, was worth the price. This moral dilemma did not go unnoticed, and in the years following the war, debates about the ethics of imperialism and trade practices began to intensify in Britain. Reformers, social activists, and intellectuals began to challenge the idea that Britain's empire should continue to expand at the expense of others' well-being. The opium trade became a flashpoint for those questioning the very nature of British power in the world. While the government and many of its citizens continued to defend their imperial actions, a growing number of voices in Britain began to advocate for change. In time, this moral unease would push Britain to reevaluate its role in the global economy, though this would be a gradual process. The decline of the opium trade would not come until later in the 19th century, but the moral questioning that started in the aftermath of the Opium War would become a significant part of Britain's evolving view on empire. The ethical costs of imperialism, the exploitation of foreign nations for economic gain, the suppression of cultures, and the suffering inflicted upon native populations would become increasingly difficult to ignore. Eventually, Britain's conscience would be pricked, leading to a reassessment of its role as a global power. The Opium War had thus created an uneasy legacy for both China and Britain. For China, it was the beginning of a century of subjugation, one marked by foreign domination and territorial loss. For Britain, it was the birth of a moral reckoning that would challenge the very foundations of imperialism and force a rethinking of how Britain would engage with the world. In the end, the legacy of the Opium War was not just about the acquisition of power, territory, or trade routes. It was about a profound shift in how both nations would understand themselves and their roles in the global order. The echoes of that war would continue to reverberate for decades, reshaping the course of history in ways neither side could have fully anticipated. The First Opium War serves as a powerful reminder of the complexities of global trade and the dark undercurrents of imperialism that shaped the course of history. At first glance, the war may seem like a simple conflict over a profitable commodity, but it was much more than that. It was the collision of two powerful empires, each with its own vision of what the world should look like. For Britain, it was about securing its economic interests, maintaining its dominance in global trade, and ultimately expanding its empire. For China, it was about defending its sovereignty, protecting its people from the devastating effects of opium, and preserving a way of life that had been undisturbed for centuries. But what stands out most in the aftermath of the First Opium War is the deep human cost that accompanied the pursuit of profit. The opium trade was not just about the exchange of goods, it was about the exploitation of human suffering on a massive scale. In Britain, opium was seen as a valuable commodity that could balance trade deficits, boost the economy, and maintain imperial power. But for the millions of Chinese people addicted to the drug, the consequences were far more dire. The spread of addiction, the collapse of families, and the erosion of social structures were just the beginning of the long-lasting effects on Chinese society. The very fabric of the nation was torn apart by the drug, and the war that followed only deepened the wounds. In many ways, the First Opium War was a reflection of the dangers of unchecked power. Britain's military superiority, backed by its powerful navy and economic influence, gave it the confidence to enforce its will on a weaker China. The British government, under Queen Victoria, defended its actions, arguing that opium was a legitimate commodity, and that China's crackdown was an affront to British property rights. The war was fought not just for control of trade routes, but for the right to continue exploiting the opium trade. This mentality was deeply rooted in imperialist thinking, where the desire for wealth and power often overshadowed basic human concerns. However, the war and its aftermath had lasting consequences for both sides. While Britain emerged victorious, it was not without its moral reckoning. The war sparked debates about the ethics of imperialism, about whether it was right to profit from a trade that destroyed lives and communities. In Britain, this conflict planted the seeds of a broader questioning of empire and the costs of expansion. The opium trade became a symbol of the dark side of imperialism, and for many, it was the beginning of a shift in how Britain viewed its role in the world. For China, the war was a humiliating defeat, but it also marked the beginning of a period of profound change. The Treaty of Nanjing, which ended the war, was a clear sign that China's power was no longer what it once was. The forced opening of ports, the cession of Hong Kong, and the imposition of extraterritorial rights for foreigners were all symbols of China's weakened state, but it was also the beginning of a deep national introspection, one that would eventually lead to a growing desire for reform and modernization. The effects of the war, both social and economic, would be felt for decades, and it was not until the early 20th century that China would begin to emerge from the shadows of imperialism. In this sense, the First Opium War serves as a cautionary tale. It teaches us that the pursuit of profit, especially when it involves exploiting vulnerable populations, can have devastating human costs. It also underscores the dangers of unchecked power, how the ability to dominate another nation, backed by superior military force, can lead to long-lasting repercussions, not just for the vanquished, but for the victors as well. The war left both Britain and China scarred, each in its own way, and its effects rippled through history, shaping the trajectory of both nations for years to come. Perhaps the most important lesson from the First Opium War is the reminder that global trade is never just about the exchange of goods. It is about the people behind those goods, the lives affected by the decisions made at the highest levels of power. The opium trade may have been driven by economic imperatives, but it was also fueled by a disregard for the lives and well-being of others. And while the British may have won the war militarily, they were forced to confront the moral implications of their actions in ways they had never anticipated. For China, the war was not just a military defeat. It was a wake-up call to the harsh realities of imperialism and a catalyst for the eventual reforms that would reshape the nation. In the end, the First Opium War is more than just a chapter in the history of China and Britain. It is a story of the human cost of empire, the moral dilemmas of trade, and the long-lasting effects of war on both the victors and the vanquished. The scars of the conflict are still visible today, a stark reminder of the complex legacy of imperialism and the importance of learning from history. As we reflect on the First Opium War, we are forced to confront some uncomfortable truths. The question of how far nations should go in the pursuit of their own interests is not merely an academic one. It is something that continues to shape the world we live in today. From trade wars to geopolitical struggles, the balance of power remains a delicate dance. But when one nation's ambition leads to the suffering of another, the consequences can be far-reaching and long-lasting. The First Opium War serves as a poignant reminder of the human cost of empire building and the dangers of prioritizing economic gain over human well-being. For China, the lessons of the Opium War were learned the hard way. It was a humiliating defeat, one that forever altered the nation's trajectory. The Treaty of Nanjing, which forced China to cede Hong Kong and open its ports to foreign trade, was a painful reminder of China's vulnerability in the face of Western power. But the scars of this conflict went deeper than just the loss of territory. The Opium War marked the beginning of what would become known as the Century of Humiliation, a period in which foreign powers carved out spheres of influence in China, exploiting its resources and undermining its sovereignty. The social and economic upheaval caused by the opium trade and the subsequent defeat left a lasting impact on the Chinese psyche. However, the Opium War also catalyzed change. In the aftermath, China began to reflect deeply on its weaknesses and the need for reform. It was a painful process, but it eventually gave rise to the self-strengthening movement, which sought to modernize China's economy and military to resist further foreign encroachment. Though the road to recovery was long and fraught with challenges, the lessons learned from the Opium War ultimately helped shape the trajectory of China's rise as a global power in the 20th and 21st centuries. But what about the victors? For Britain, the war was a clear military success. The British Empire expanded, and its economic interests were further entrenched in China. But the moral dilemmas that arose in the aftermath of the war did not dissipate as easily as the immediate benefits of victory. The opium trade, though immensely profitable, was a destructive force that led many in Britain to question the ethics of imperialism. The moral questions raised by the First Opium War would continue to haunt British society, fueling debates over the ethics of empire and the cost of progress. In fact, the First Opium War set the stage for a broader reckoning with imperialism, one that would unfold over the following decades. The realization that empire building could be built on the backs of the suffering of others began to seep into public consciousness. Though Britain had won the war and expanded its empire, it was clear that the true cost of empire was more than just the spoils of war. The legacy of the Opium War forced Britain, like many other imperial powers, to confront the darker side of empire building and to question the principles upon which its power had been built. As we look at the modern world today, the legacy of the First Opium War remains relevant. The global trade systems that were shaped by this conflict are still in place, and the dynamics of power and influence continue to evolve. The war may have ended nearly 2 centuries ago, but its reverberations are still felt in the geopolitics of the 21st century. As nations continue to navigate the complexities of international relations, the lessons of the Opium War are a cautionary tale, urging us to consider not just the material rewards of our actions, but also the human cost. So, as we reflect on this pivotal moment in history, we must ask ourselves, how far are we willing to go in the pursuit of our own interests, and at what cost? The answers to these questions are more important than ever, as they shape the world we live in and the future we are creating. The First Opium War may be a chapter in history, but its lessons are timeless. It reminds us that the pursuit of power, profit, and control must always be tempered by a sense of morality and responsibility. Only by learning from the past can we hope to build a more just and equitable future